and I'm starting it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our Windows Virtual Desktop webinar. We'll begin here in just a sec. We'll just give some people a little bit more time to join in. Just give this another minute or so. All right, Vinita, if you want to go ahead and get started, now's a good time.
All right. Okay. Hear me well, right, Ben?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining into this WVD webinar. It's our ongoing series where we are touching upon the concepts of WVD along with a quick short demo. So I'll just get right into it. So my name is Vineet. I'm the lead architect at BrainScale. And today's session is all going to be about WVD and how you can utilize some of the core constructs of WVD. So I guess we will be talking about some of the use cases as we go along. But just a quick intro about us. We are BrainScale, a gold partner with Microsoft. We do a lot of provide a lot of cloud-related services to our customers. Being a gold partner enables us to work with some of the large customers. As of now, we are working with some of them, implementing some of these kind of WVD kind of solutions because of these unprecedented times. And also, we offer some of our own solutions on different areas, be it cost, migration assessments, data modernization, so on and so forth. So yeah, so we are headquartered in New Jersey, and you know, if you'd ever like to reach back to us, please feel free to drop a note. So getting right into the agenda for today. So today's webinar is talking about the WVD core value prop and a little bit of intro into digging into the architecture of WVD. Also, I will be talking about from a deployment perspective, how quickly you can get started with WVD and wind it up with a quick demo. So I'll keep some time towards the end where we can do some Q&A. So I'm hoping that it should be done in 45 minutes, and I'll keep the next 10 minutes for any Q&A. All right. So just getting started, you know, we all know today virtualization has made its way into almost pretty much everything in all the business use cases that we have today. So virtually everybody is on the cloud in some way or the other, right? Even if your apps today are not hosted, you are at the end of the day a cloud user. And when we talk about virtualization, specifically in the context of, let's say, virtualized desktops, there are various business use cases that it can get applied to, right? From government organizations, from anybody who's managing BPO or call centers today, right? People who are working basically remote and probably do not have access to their desktops, right? And anybody who's doing a usual software development work, right? Design and engineering kind of work. So various use cases so today for any kind of a virtualized environment, and specifically when we talk about Windows Virtual Desktop, this is Microsoft Desktop as a Service offering on Azure, and this is an offering which offers you multi-session Windows 10 images on the cloud, which is where really the core value prop of WVD is. So you could go ahead today and deploy these shared or pooled multi-session desktops on the cloud, and you can make the maximum value of your, from a cost perspective, from a value perspective, the maximum value, you can derive a maximum value out of your deployment, really. So before we talk about why WVD really makes sense, right? We just need to touch upon why did it came at the first place, right? Because Microsoft already had a traditional RDS offering, and if any one of you have used the RDS in the past, you would have set up a lot of infrastructure components, right? Management components. So some of these components are setting up of gateways, brokers, right? Licensing servers, then the web access servers, right? So all of these, and ultimately the session host, which hosts the VDs behind, right? So all of this requires some skill, some time, right? And at the end of the day, you'd need some sort of a labor to kind of manage this infrastructure, right? So be it on the cloud, be it on-prem, there is time, effort, cost, all of that kind of is involved onto it, right? So again, it is not as simple. So like I said, people need to have a thorough understanding of integrating the RDS infrastructure within their own infrastructure, right? So realizing that, Microsoft came up with Windows Virtual Desktop, and pretty much the key selling point over here, right, is that the entire management stack or the management layer, which is on the top, is completely managed by Microsoft, right? So in WVD, there is no setting up of these gateways. There is no setting up of connection brokers, no concept of setting up your own load balancing. So all of that is taken care by by the platform itself. And this is really, again, deployed on top of the Azure platform. So there is going to be the compute, storage, and networking piece, which is going to be the underneath piece. So at the end of the day, you as a customer are only looking to manage your own images that you're deploying on virtual desktops in your subscriptions in Azure, right? So it simplifies that entire management piece quite a bit, right? And gives you that flexibility just to manage your own scale, right? To get you set up in I would say in a matter of hours, right? Keeping in mind that you're secure on the cloud. So this management of the complete top layer by Microsoft is a huge plus point of, I would say, using WVD today, right? And we'll talk about some more details of where, from an architecture perspective, how it is really secure, right, as we go along. But from a core value prop, there are a few areas I would like to quickly touch upon. So where is really the WVD value, right? There are various areas. So from a user experience standpoint, to security, to management, right, which is typically where you would derive a lot of value out of using WVD today. So if you're in this situation where you're looking to deploy WVDs on the cloud, you're obviously concerned with a lot of these things because these are unprecedented times, right? You need access to your organization users really need access to these desktops at a very fast pace, right? But at the same time, the IT needs to be fully sure that they're making sure that it's deployed in a secure way. It's manageable at the end of the day, so they have a full control over what's really happening at the WVD layer. And last but not the least, you also see some sort of economics, right, out of this, right? Is it cost effective for me, right? If I go ahead with WVD today or not? So all those things is something we are going to touch upon real quick. So starting with the first thing, which is the best virtualized end user experience. Again, Microsoft has made a ton of improvements in terms of accessing WVD as an end user, right? So you have various clients today available. So if you're using any of your platforms today, right, which is thin clients like HTML5 web browsers, or if you're using Android devices, or if you're just using Windows PC, all of them have got clients available to access the WVD environment, right? And some of the other things which would make sense is Microsoft has taken, again, steps in terms of making sure if you're an Office 365 user, which most likely you might be, that your Office 365 environment for those users also tend to perform in a very optimal fashion. There are performance improvements that you see if you tend to use Office 365 on the WVD environments as well. And again, there is obviously improvements, or rather new technology, which is introduced when it comes to management of your user profiles. So we'll talk about that as well. So the other things, when it comes to the user experience, sorry about that. Yeah. Along with the user experience is the enhanced security, right? So this is what I said is the key request or ask, rather, if you're working on your traditional RDS infrastructure, you would have already done that quite a bit. But when you move to WVD on the cloud, how do those principles really apply again, right? So WVD ties nicely into Azure AD today. So if you're using WVD on the cloud, you can go ahead and secure with the same standard MFAs, conditional access, using Azure AD on the cloud. You obviously, the technology is built in such a way that there are no inbound connections onto the session host. So wherever the virtual desktops are running, really they only originate an outbound connection to the management infrastructure. So the end user or anybody else cannot directly make an inbound request directly onto the virtualized desktops, right? So which highly reduces your surface area for attacks. And once again, these sessions are isolated. So any n number of users signing in really really are not connected to the other sessions, right? So we'll go into some of these details as we go along, but key points right now, right, to talk about. Again, from a management standpoint, it becomes really, the user experience management is really simplified. So Microsoft gives a complete management portal where you can go ahead and manage the WVD infrastructure, as well as runs the diagnostics that you would like to. Again, since this is a common service which allows you to both host your desktops and your remote apps, right? So that's again a plus point from a management perspective, that you're only looking at one piece of service, which is basically taking care of both the things, right? So the other things, because it's on the cloud, because it's on Azure, from a management, from the VMs management, because at the end of the day, the virtual desktops are really hosted on the VMs. So the VM management is again, the way you would manage your VMs or infrastructure on the cloud. So the same principles would apply, but then you could still continue to use all those value-added services that Microsoft has in terms of ASR, if you'd like to do disaster recovery, or use update management service of Azure, or continue to use your own on-prem infrastructure, which you currently use to manage your VMs. Okay, again, superior economics. So why this makes sense is obviously because if you're today you could directly use a Windows 10 multi-session image on the cloud, which is again only available for WVD. So if you're looking to really, like I said, make the maximum use of it, you would need to provide an infrastructure where multiple sessions can be established on the same VM. And that is typically where the Windows 10 image or the experience would come in, right? Which would really drive down the cost, because it'll lower down the costs based on the number of users that you have. And then, again, from a licensing point of view, if you're already a Office 365 customer, E3, E5 license or an F3 license, then you're automatically eligible for using these licenses for WVD in the sense that there is no additional CAL cost that you would incur, right? And because you are not having to manage the entire management infrastructure, which is the session hosts, the brokers, right? The management hosts. So all that pieces kind of baked into the platform. So all those savings really, come into the picture from a management standpoint, right? Okay. So some of the other things to mention, if you're again, Microsoft has partnered with some of the vendors like Citrix today. If you're using Citrix on-prem, you also have the ability to kind of do a hybrid deployment, extend Citrix VDI infrastructure onto Azure. So that's possible. And there are other partners which play in some of the areas where, let's say, you want to get some assessments done before you want to move to WVD in order to identify what kind of a setup that you would want on Azure today in terms of sizing, in terms of performance. So there are other partners which provide these kind of key capabilities. So for instance, you could use Lakeside to assess your infrastructure, which would give you a quick insight in terms of what your sizing could be on the cloud, right? Okay. So some of the other details, like I said, I've already talked about this. There's a rich experience. We'll see a few clients on how you could use different kinds of clients to connect to the WVD infrastructure, right? And again, because we are talking about user experience, really when you look at some of the remote apps which are deployed on the WVD infrastructure, that you really cannot make out the difference if you're accessing a local app or a remote app, right? And there is ton of enhancements when it comes to the UI, a ton of enhancements when it comes to performance. And again, it's like you accessing your local Windows 10 VM. The experience is pretty similar to that, right? So the other things is the WVD clients or the protocol itself provides you some of the, I would say, invisible benefits, intangible benefits. You can basically have all kinds of redirections. It adopts to your bandwidth utilization, right? So some of the things which you would expect in any kind of a VDI solution, given that users might come in from all sorts of different connections at the end of the day, right? All kinds of clients at the end of the day. So those things are kind of taken care of at the protocol level as well. So one of the things that I want to touch about here is, again, because you would be deploying your users in a pooled environment so that you most likely get the maximum value out of your investment. So ultimately, these user profiles, anybody who logs in a pooled environment, what that means is if a user A were to log in on a VM number 1, and the next day he comes in, he could just go into another VM, right? So how do we really make sure that his profile is intact, his profile is attached back? So typically this is done by the SS Logics technology in the background, but these are all containerized profiles, and you would pretty much see that they are dynamically attached as soon as the user is logging into a VM. So it's a seamless experience. You would really not even know that your profiles are currently getting attached. But this is a big benefit if you tend to use WVD today, right? Okay. So some of the other things, if you're once again an Office 365 user, you would tend to derive the benefits of improvements in performance if you're using Outlook, if you're loading your Outlook's mailbox, if you're using Windows Desktop Search. So all those things once again are kind of very much enhanced. The details are also available on the Microsoft documentation, but I just want to kind of bring this out here that this is one more big benefit if you look at moving to WVD with Office 365, right? So from a security standpoint, just to do a quick comparison, if you're today deployed on-prem, and once again, or if you're looking to deploy on-prem from an RDS standpoint, you will see that you tend to, again, anybody who's been to that journey and probably enabled MFA with Azure AD with an on-prem RDS infrastructure, you would have gone through the NPS installations, on your on-prem gateway boxes, right? So it requires, once again, it's a labor-intensive task. It requires a bit of a skill, right, to get it right. But whereas on the other hand, if you're today moving on to WVD, you're all set right from the word go, right? And you have, since you are integrated to Azure AD as a platform, uh, conditional access, MFA is something that you get right out of the box. So it's something that you don't have to worry about setting yourself up. So that's a big plus when it comes to security. Once again, from an attack perspective, this is just a little bit into how things are from a WVD connection standpoint. So again, from an on-prem, you would have to basically make sure that you're securing all your inbound ports because they're open, right? In case of WVD, it's a much less attack surface area that's been exposed because the session hosts really do not expose anything inbound. So the remote VMs basically reverse connects to the WVD gateway services. So just to expand it a little bit more, what I'm trying to say here is, if you look at this piece of diagram, right, I can just highlight some of the things. So this is the clients. This is how the users are going to connect. This is that middle layer of management, which is something which is abstracted away from you now when it comes to WVD. And right over here are your session hosts. This is typically where your desktops are going to be hosted, right? So this infrastructure really is making an outbound call or connection, bidirectional connection to the management infrastructure, right? So your clients are really connecting in, and they really don't have any way to reach out because there is no inbound onto this infrastructure. So they really don't have any way to kind of reach out to your desktop hosted VMs. So the technology allows you to do that. It's secure by default, right? And some of the other things that you're used to using is basically, can we have RBAC? Sure. Again, it's hosted. It follows the same principles like you do for your other Azure infrastructure, right? Or for your VMs or any other resources that you deploy on the Azure platform. So the same way you can basically designate owners, contributors, who will have different kinds of access, right, onto the system. Okay. So once again, this is something that I already said in the beginning. So the user sessions are isolated, whether you're using a multi-session image or a single session image, right? So the user data is always, or the user sessions are always going to be isolated into the WVD environment. Okay. So one other thing is from an experience standpoint, because you can expose both desktops and remote apps to your end users. So comparing this again to an on-prem environment, this is a single service where you can configure if you want to expose either remote apps or desktops. So there is less management. It's a single service that provides both the experiences today. The other thing is, again, some of the tools, from an on-prem standpoint, typically how you do stuff, but then when you come to cloud, you get some other benefits. You could use Azure Update Management today very easily to manage and patch your VMs. And then again, Azure has got this concept of providing you the capabilities to create your images, put them in shared image galleries, right? So you could utilize all of that to publish your golden images and keep patching them over a period of time, and then keep basically spinning up environments based on that. So yeah, and when you deploy an environment like this, you would need some quick insights into the diagnostics, right? In case things were to not work the way you'd expect them to be, you would want to kind of go back and really see where exactly the problem is, and you could export all of this diagnostic information into nice looking dashboards where you could basically analyze what kind of sessions you're running, who's coming in, how much of your consumption is going on, right, across the session host, things like that, right? Which would take you some time to set it up if you're on-prem. Again, and on-prem, you would have to manage not only the session host infrastructure, but you'll have to manage the other pieces, other plumbing pieces also, which are kind of abstracted away and fully managed by Microsoft. Okay, just touching real quick on the economics. If you're, once again, if you're a licensed O365 E3, E5, F3 organization, you would have the access to using Windows 10 multi-session images in the cloud, which would mean that many users could come in onto a single VM that you have created. So if you create a big box, you could have many sessions on that, right? Which saves you a lot of cost because ultimately you could utilize those boxes more effectively, right? So from an economics perspective, you would tend to use with the multi-session image a lot of money, right? Once again, you will still have to do, so the disclaimer over here is you still have to do your sizing, right? You still have to figure out what kind of VMs that you would have to create, how many sessions that you could support on a single box, things like that. So all that sizing activity needs to be done before you can arrive at a cost and probably some sort of an ROI in terms of how much you save on the cloud, right? So the other things is, again, if you're coming on Azure, you still have the ability to effectively use things because you could scale them, you could shut VMs down, right? So you could do all of that. And not only that, the big benefit of really moving onto the cloud is you could basically use things like reserved instances, right? So if you're in a decent sized environment, if you really apply that reserved instance model also 1 year or 3 year, then you tend to save a lot of money. At the end of the day, that's a huge cost savings for your WVD environment. Okay, so I think I just talked about this, but yeah, the only thing is, if you're to remember is what I talked about being no CALs is true for Windows 10. If you still use Windows Server RDS environment in WVD, then you would still have to have RDS CALs that you would need. Okay, so yeah, once again, Microsoft does provide a management layer. Now, this management layer, again, from a management standpoint, this is still hosted as a separate portal today. But then there is a portal that's provided where you can basically manage your tenants, your host pools, the entire WVD environment today on the cloud. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and skip this. I already spoke about that. So one last thing, again, we touched upon this because the entire management infrastructure is PaaS, managed by Microsoft. So you really don't need to kind of spend any labor costs on that. So the only thing that you would have labor costs is on managing your session host environment and basically creating and putting in the diagnostics infrastructure on top of that. But at the end of the day, because that entire management piece, which is used in traditional RDS infrastructure, is taken away or abstracted away from you, you see a ton of saving, on the cloud, really. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about a little bit about the concepts, some of them in, from an architecture standpoint. So the first thing, if you're going to go inside of a WVD, if you're not there already today, you would basically tend to deploy host pools. So what are host pools really, right? So you would eventually deploy a bunch of session hosts, which are going to be serving the virtual desktops to your end users. So for me, a host pool is nothing but a logical grouping of a set of VMs, which probably are used for a certain specific group in your organization, or maybe you are classifying a certain different category of users. For example, the users which are really heavy users on the infrastructure, the users which are basically not so heavy, where they just need a browser to work with, right? So at the end of the day, host pool lets you group these users. So if you're either you can decide it based on your departments or whatever your categorization logic is today, but you have the ability to create multiple host pool, as many as you like. So that really groups a set of users, and it provides them that particular infrastructure at the end of the day, right? So in a host pool, you specify the kind of the VM that you would use in the background, how many users are going to be there, part of that host pool, right? So all those things are going to become part of that host pool. And last but not the least, you would tend to use a particular kind of image, VM image, which would be used to provide the virtual desktops to that category of users, right? So it's very flexible. This piece really allows you to kind of separate sort of users based on different use cases, right? So when the users would come in, by default, there is an option to configure the load balancing mode as well on a host pool. You could basically specify it as a breadth mode or a depth mode. That again depends on your requirements, totally based on your scenarios. So what it really means is once the user starts to come in onto your WVD environment, a breadth mode of load balancing would really make sure that the sessions first go to all the available VMs, and then that's they first cover the breadth and then keep piling up as the new users were to come in. You could also deploy it on the depth mode. What that would mean is you basically want to make sure first a single VM gets loaded, so all the sessions that come in, they go onto a session host till the time that gets full, and then slowly they start to move onto the subsequent VMs, right? So the choice in this case really is yours. Once again, based on your use case. But just to really sum it up, just to kind of provide an overview, if you're familiar with the Azure terminology, we can just correlate that terminology to the WVD side. So the first thing that you would do while spinning up your WVD environment is to really create a tenant group. In a tenant group, below the tenant group, you would create tenants. So mostly for a single organization, you would tend to create a single tenant, right? So there's no point creating multiple tenants, but you still have the ability to do that, right? Maybe for some compliance reasons or for some legal reasons if you have to, right? And then below that is that concept or the core concept of host pools. So really the first step is setting up the tenant. This is typically where you would spend a little bit of a time. Once first the tenant is set up, then you're all set. After that, anybody can come in, or your owners of the tenant would come in and then start to create host pools. Now, this is really creation of that virtualized desktop environment. And a host pool, like I said, is nothing but it's a logical container. All it is contains is session hosts, which are nothing but VMs, and which are at the end of the day hosting your virtual desktops for your end users, right? So you would encounter this terminology once you start to deploy WVD, right? So it's pretty straightforward to understand. But from a prerequisite standpoint, if you decide to go with WVD on the cloud, at a minimum, you would need some of the core things like an Azure subscription, Azure AD, right? You need to have some strategy on how your identity management is going to happen. Mostly, all of the customers typically sync their on-prem AD onto Azure AD. So that's something that is a prerequisite, right? And then there is some sort of connectivity needed, either via site-to-site or VPNs or express route from the Azure environment back to on-prem. There is obviously, to make this work, you obviously need to set up some credentials, which are going to act as the tenant group owners, the host pool owners, right? So you create service principals on Azure AD so that all this environment can be spin up, right? So this is something that I already mentioned, that you would basically look at some sort of a hybrid kind of an environment. Most of the customers typically tend to have this because they're not just providing desktops which are not connected to on-prem. So you would have some sort of a hybrid connectivity, and then you would basically make use of either express route or site-to-site VPNs to make sure that your WVD environment really can talk back to your on-prem for whatever app access that it needs, right? One more thing from a network standpoint is needed is because, like I said, this is a reverse connect technology. The session hosts are connecting to the management infrastructure, so they really need some outbound connectivity to some of the Microsoft URLs, and some of them that we have mentioned over here on this slide deck over here. So you can see, I can just highlight some of them over here, right? So these are the outbound URLs which need access to from the session host environment. So it's very easy to set up. Again, if you want to route all the outbound traffic via your firewalls, you still can do that, right? But still, these URLs would need to be allowed. Or on your network security groups, you would have to just allow 443 outbound. Okay, so again, just a little bit about the profiles part as well. Once you set up WVD, your users would come in. ultimately their profiles are going to get assigned, and their profiles are going to be stored in, you have a future set of choices. So today you could host the profiles on some sort of a common file share, which you could host using storage spaces in cloud itself, or you could use Azure Files, or you could use a NetApp appliance. So, really the choice over here is yours based on the number of profiles that you have, the kind of bandwidth you're looking for, the kind of IOs you're looking for. So it all really depends on that, and probably your comfort level at the end of the day with choosing one of those technologies, right? So, from a profile management standpoint, it's like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into this. Maybe talk about this during the demo, but you would feel that as though there is absolutely everything is really coming in from your local environment. But when you're signing in, really what's happening in the background is your profile or your profile VHT that has been created is really getting attached to the session host you're logging into, right? There are some optimizations which are being done by virtue of the FS Logics technology. So I'm going to be able to talk about that here. So ultimately, like I said, the options for you really are, if you look at a classic VDI VM where VM gets deployed with data disks, a VM with a FS Logic profile really is pointing to a file share at the end of the day. So if you look at this piece itself, you could basically have a common infrastructure where all your, in the file share, all your profile disks are located, right? And you could basically advance this a little bit more if you're today using Azure Files already on Azure today. So you could use Azure Profiles to keep your profile data. The big plus point, obviously, is because it's Azure Files. You have it's completely managed by Microsoft, right? And it provides ton of other capabilities. So you really don't have to manage and maintain that infrastructure, at the end of the day. Okay. All right. So some of the other, few things that you will again have to pay close attention to is how are you going to manage your images on the cloud? To begin with, you would need to have a golden image, which is set according to your standards. A lot of people tend to kind of make images closer to what they have on-prem or based on some CIS standards, right? And at the end of the day, they basically make sure, because the VMs are domain joined, a lot of that gets pushed via your group policies anyways. But to begin with, a basic set of software, basic set of agents, if they are needed, you will have to create an image, golden image. And ultimately, you probably can go ahead and use a lot of technologies that you already have, either Azure Update Management to continue to update that, or if you're using SCCM to push patches and updates, that could be your regular path, right? So one of the things that we are not touching upon today is app masking here. So there's a new technology which you could use really to make sure that you can create a golden image and then ultimately apply applications like you're applying profiles. Then you can attach applications based on who the user is or who's the user who's logging in, right? So that's something which is pretty brand new, which is again going to become a very good selling point when it comes to WVD, right? So once again, from a patching perspective, you can use Azure Update Management, like I said, or you could still continue to use same principles apply, like you would do it for your on-prem VMs. Typically how you run your updates. The only thing here is to continue to keep in mind is, you have to do it in stages because at the end of the day, there are multiple sessions that are hosted on your VMs. So you will have to kind of devise a strategy in terms of how do you drain the sessions out and apply the patches and then move on to the next set of VMs. Okay. So I will basically talk about the deployment and management a little bit, the management piece a little bit later. But from a deployment standpoint, today you could just go to Azure portal if you want to get started quickly and deploy the WVD host pool infrastructure, or you could use various ARM templates which Microsoft provides on GitHub with some other additional functionality to kind of host, your host pools on the cloud. One thing to remember is A lot of the management is again available inside of the Azure portal itself, but still the best way to continue to manage is again through PowerShell. So, at some level, your team needs to be well versed with PowerShell so they can continue to fully manage this infrastructure via PowerShell. Okay. So once again, WVD supports full desktop or remote apps. So it's again your call if you want to publish full desktops to your end users. But if there are some users who really do not need an access to desktop, just need an access to probably a Office app, the choice is really yours. So within the same host pool environment, you can decide to publish either a full desktop to a user or maybe just a remote app to the end users. And again, from a performance guidelines, we usually, like I said, this is not a, there is some guidelines, some baselines that Microsoft provides as inputs to the customer. But, from a performance perspective, you would really have to do some sort of an exercise where you can come to an idea about what should be your correct sizing when it comes to the WVD shared environment, right? Where exactly you would be deployed, at data from a data center perspective, those are easier questions, I would say, to answer. But in terms of the scaling, in terms of the sizing of the VMs, that is where you may want to spend a little bit more time deciding how you are going to get more cost effective and also have the best performance coming out of the infrastructure that you deploy today. Okay. Again, the usual rules apply because you're going to be using the Microsoft Windows 10 image on the cloud. The golden image is going to be based on that. So make sure that you test your applications and also try to leverage the Azure shared image galleries. So today Azure provides both the shared image galleries to maintain whatever images that you are publishing. And from an image creation itself, if you already use something on-prem like a Packer kind of an environment, you can continue to use that, or Azure has as a native technology now, Azure Image Builder or AIB, that could be used in combination with the shared image galleries to provide this kind of a solution, right? Okay. You also have the ability not only to do multi-session environments using the Windows 10 image, you could also create your host pool environment in a more dedicated host standpoint. So if you really want one user to come in and hit the same VM over and over again and probably provide them the dedicated VM access, that is also possible to deploy on WVD. Okay, so a couple of things before we go into the demo. So you do have the options to do monitoring via Azure Monitor and create dashboards. And also, like I said before, along with PowerShell, Microsoft does give a management dashboard, which you could utilize today to really manage your session hosts in the background and various other things. So with that, let me just quickly move on to a short demo. So what we have over here is, the first thing that I want to start is with is the management piece that I was describing about, right? So before I come to management piece, the first experience, right? So how do you access WVD today, right? So your clients, as we were saying that you could use multiple clients. So this is a browser thin client, right? So I've logged in. We have a WVD demo environment. So I've logged in as myself, and when I log in, really, I've logged in through Azure AD, so the same MFA conditional access policies apply to me. When I sign in, I basically see what I have access to. So this is my host pool right over here, right? So I've got access to only one host pool. So if I just go ahead, I'm going to be logging into the VM, and then it's going to ask me to log in onto my demo environment. So let's just try to do that again. Oh, just go ahead and do a refresh. Okay, so now I can log in onto with my domain credentials onto my virtualized desktop environment. And you can see that I straight away go inside my VM. I have the kind of ability to install applications on it, right? And my user profile is currently being saved. So if I go back to the Azure environment over here, we have basically kept profiles inside of Azure files. So I can just really quick open up my storage account, go to the profile folder, and this is typically where we have all of our profiles which are being stored. So I've logged in. This is pretty much my profile. This is typically where it's stored in Azure files. And if I were to log out, log in, and go on to potentially another box, my profile is again going to be reattached. The VHT is again going to be reattached. If I go inside my profile, VHT is inside, right? So yeah, coming back to my client. So this is in a shared environment. I can just go ahead and log out from here, right? And this is a thin client, right? So I also have a thick client. So I could just show you the thick client. So this is a thick client which I've installed on my box, right? And in this thick client, if I look at the details, I have logged in as a different user. That's not me. So if you see that this user again has got access to the same tenant. He's part of the same tenant in host pool, but he does not have an access to the whole desktop. But in this case, only the apps have been published to him, right? So he can just go ahead and continue to work on these Office apps, keep his data saved up in his profile, and pretty much that's how it's going to work out for him, right? So when we go back, so just touching upon from an Azure standpoint, right? Azure gives you this ability from the portal itself to provision a host pool. We assume that a lot of this tenant creation is already being taken care of. So in this case, I just want to talk about a few important things when you're creating a host pool or a WVD host pool for your organization, right? So some of the core things to remember is this is typically where you can specify, am I going to go in for a pooled environment where X amount of VMs are going to be shared across Y number of users, right? Or really, I want to give a dedicated desktop environment, right? So most likely, like I said, most of the use cases that we see, they tend to deploy in a pooled environment because it's more economically favorable, right? So you specify the information over here, you specify the users who are going to be accessing this environment, right? And then really over here, this is where some of the key inputs have to really come in from a customer, right? What kind of a usage profile your users have, right? So you could basically specify some of the preset ones. The only thing that it's trying to tell you is that Microsoft has done some benchmarks. They have created a baseline. So if you select medium usage profile and say that you have 100 users, right, that are going to be accessing your VDI, then their recommendation is that you should go ahead with 7 D4 V3 kind of VMs, right? So this is again just a guideline, but you would still have to go back and really do your assessment in terms of arriving at the right sizing for your WVD environment. And last but not the least, you could specify the images. So multi-session image is available out of the box, but you could also create your own golden image based on this image with the additional software that you need and put it inside of the managed image gallery, right? And then after that, you really specify where these VMs are going to be hosted, the VNets, the domain join kind of credentials, some of the other information which is needed from the ownership perspective. So, and that's pretty much it to spin up your WVD environment. So this is typically a process which takes about 15 to 30 minutes. And once that's done, your host pool is provisioned. And then you can go back to your management portal, to basically see what's really running inside of my host pool. So I've created over here the script tenant. This is typically what I'm using. If I go to host pools, we have only one host pool, which is script RDS created over there. And inside of this host pool is where I can see how many session hosts I have today, right? And this is where you could also see whether these hosts right now are allowing new sessions or not. So what this really means is maybe you want to create or test something, right, with a new image. You can go ahead and add that, test it out, and then probably, then probably roll it out in production. Or you've rolled out, you've added new session hosts into the environment. You're decommissioning the older ones. Then what you can do is you could select any kind of a session host, and you can basically, edit them and say, don't allow any more new sessions, right? And then ultimately you can go ahead and drain the sessions out from there, right? So you have some level of flexibility on this management portal. This management portal still is, as you can see from the URL, is still not part of the Azure portal itself. But as of now, it does let you, do this neat management task, which ultimately either you'll do it from PowerShell or you could just come out to this UI and do it yourself. Okay. One other thing is, so you also have the monitoring dashboards. This is something you could set it up yourself. So we have created a very basic dashboard where you could see the sessions which are currently running in, right? How many are active, how many are disconnected, what's going on from a network CPU standpoint, right? So all those, some of those things pretty much can be configured and viewed in your diagnostics dashboard, right? Once you set up this WVD environment. Okay, so so with that, I'm kind of done. Come to the end of my demo. So just a parting thought is this is typically how a WVD looks like in the real world. So this is from one of our customers. We've just generalized this image. But ultimately, the WVD infrastructure, if that were to be deployed on the cloud, would tend to have these many pieces, from an architecture standpoint. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for attending this webinar. We've got about 8 minutes left. I will take up any questions if we have in the Q&A. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for going over that, Vineet. That was really awesome. As Vineet said, we're sticking around a little bit to see if there's any Q&A action. So feel free to put any questions you may have, and we'll answer those as needed. Give it just a couple minutes here to see if any come in. All right, I'm not seeing any questions come in. All participants have my email, as I've emailed information about this webinar previously. So if any questions do arise, feel free to reach out to me individually, and I'll be happy to find those answers for you and get them to you as soon as possible. Thanks everybody for joining. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.